So as you can see on the screen here, we have a lot of concepts to cover this week. So hopefully this video won't end up being too long, but I promise you all of the information is really important. So even if you're a skip through kind of person, at least pause on the concepts and take notes on those as you go. So we're going to be covering self, identity theory, social identity theory, and uncertainty. So first, identities. Identities, you've heard this term a lot, I'm sure, but so just to kind of make sure we're all starting from the same place, when we talk about identities, we mean the traits and characteristics, social relations, and social group memberships that define who somebody is. And so we're going to go into more detail about that definition piece, like who actually does the defining. Your identities, they can be focused on a lot of things, right? It can be on the past, who you were, what you used to be, what you used to do, the present, what you're doing right now, or the future, who you want to be. So all of these temporal pieces are really important. You can have an identity when you're a child that's completely different from the identity you have as an adult. It can even be you're on vacation. Your identity during spring break is probably different than your identity during finals week. So all of these different pieces related to time are really important, and it's important to acknowledge those identities can still be true identities, even if they only persist for a short period of time. So Cooley is somebody we're going to be talking about a decent amount today. And so he says that we develop our identities in response to how we understand other people perceiving ourselves. So we're going to talk about that more in a concept called the looking glass self, but keep that in mind as we move. So there are different ways to see identity. These are some of the really foundational pieces, so it's really important that everything on the screen right now you get. Hammer this into your head. However you take notes, take lots of notes on these. So we have the immersed versus the collective. So these, again, are probably terms that we're familiar with, but maybe not in this sort of context. So immersed is thinking about how you are different, how you are separate, how you're not the same as everybody else. And it's really focused more on the micro. So up close and personal, really specific about what's happening, internally in your mind or, in the other person who identity you're thinking about in their mind. And then the collective focuses on more of the macro. It's thinking about how does everything kind of fit together into this bigger whole? How is it connected through the relationships that either we choose to build or that we're forced to build? So immersed is a self and collective is the whole. Really important. And then ways of viewing that are connected to this are field and observer. So observer is when you're kind of having that out-of-body experience. So you're looking down and seeing the whole big picture, including yourself. It makes it very much less personal. It's more of just, seeing a subjective view of what's happening. Field is using your own perspective. So this is like what you're seeing through your eyes. So you aren't actually part of the vision anymore because you are the vision. So this becomes much more emotional, right? Because it's coming through the person, through you. We have some images here that kind of show this, right? So on the left side is that field or that personal perspective. So it's just what you can take in. You can't see yourself, right? You don't have eyes floating above you to be able to see. So this is just what you see out in front of you. Whereas the observer is separating from yourself to be able to see the full picture, you included. So maybe these visuals help to make that a little bit more clear. So then moving on from that, we also have this idea of multiple me's. So like I talked about different identities during different times. You can also, with that, have different identities in different spaces. So you might have one identity at home with your parents and a different identity when you're in your dorm with your friends, or when you're at work, or when you're in the car, right? All these different places can have different identities as well. But so we kind of classify those identities into 3 different categories. So collective or social identities are part of your group membership. So who do you become when you're with these other people? How do you decide to be with these other people? Later in the semester, we're going to talk a lot about different like music and TV fandoms, and so collective identities are going to be really strong there. We're going to talk about that a lot. But you could also think about like the sports teams that you support. You behave in a certain way when you support the Baltimore Ravens versus when you support I was going to say the Oakland Raiders. They're not the Oakland Raiders anymore. Whoever the Raiders are, there's different kind of vibes that come from these different teams. And so those identities will be really strong when you're in that environment, but then maybe when you're like in the office, that identity isn't going to come through as strong. Then you have role identity, and so this is identity connected to what you do. So a lot of times we see these in familial circumstances. So if you were like the firstborn, or if you're a mother, or if you're an only child, all of these things really impact the roles that you carry out in that environment. So, do you become a caretaker? Are you the caretakee? And we also have personal identities. And so those can be impacted by the group identity or the role identity, but they can also be separate, and they can be much more connected to what we think about ourselves. So this can just be, as simple as, are you a confident person? Do you have a lot of self-esteem? Do you have an identity that connects to being somebody who's really self-assured, confident they can do whatever they want, or an identity that maybe is a little bit less confident, a little bit meeker, more reserved? So collective, role, personal identity, again, 3 really, really important things that we're going to keep talking about through the whole semester. So here, there's a short poem. So this is from the researcher Cooley, who I mentioned earlier, called Through the Looking Glass. So read this to yourself. Obviously, you can see I bolded the last line here. So this is really the key piece to what we're going to get into, called the looking glass self theory. So I am what I think you think I am. It's a little convoluted, right? But so this is essentially playing up the idea that, we change our actions or our behaviors or the way that we even present based on how we think other people are thinking about us. So it's not actually saying how they think about us, it's how we think they think about us, right? There's an extra level in there that leads to potentially confusion, misunderstandings, but it can, according to Cooley, have a really big role in shaping how we alter our identities. As you become more aware of your identity, you're going to be paying more attention to it, and you're going to be potentially trying to change it more often. Especially, looking glass self is a really great thing to be talking about when we're in this more social media oriented society. If you're TikToking, or even just having a selfie camera option, you are shaping the way that you speak. I mean, sometimes even the way that people say words, right? They try to change how they move their mouth based on how it looks looking in that camera. And so all of that relates back to how we think other people are thinking about us. So I have a short lecture from Khan Academy that kind of breaks this down a little bit more, gives you an example. So watch that, but think about this poem as you do it, that you think aspect.
Socialization describes the process by which people learn the attitudes, values, and behaviors that are appropriate and expected by their culture and community. And it typically occurs through the observation of and interaction with the people we are surrounded by. And this could include those who are close to us, like our family, friends, and teachers, but it can also include everyone else that we come across in our daily lives. Our doctors, nurses, celebrities that we see on TV and in the movies, even the people standing in line next to us at the supermarket. They all have something to teach us about how we should act within our community. But socialization also shapes our self-image, or how we view ourselves. And sociologist Charles Cooley used the term looking glass self in order to describe this process. And he theorized that our view of ourselves comes not only from our direct contemplation of our personal qualities, but also from our perceptions about how we are being perceived by others. And Cooley thought that this happened through 3 steps. First, we imagine how we must appear to others, to our families or friends or just people on the street. Second, we imagine how they must evaluate us based on their observations of us. So do we come across as intelligent or funny or shy or maybe just awkward? And third, we develop feelings about ourselves based on our impressions of their evaluations and their observations. And one critical aspect of this theory that I want to point out is that Cooley believed that we are not actually being influenced by the opinions of others, but instead we are being influenced by what we imagine the opinions of other people to be. So according to this theory, we might develop our self-identities based on both correct and incorrect perceptions of how others see us. So let's say that we have this teacher and they're grading a paper very harshly. They're grading it very critically. And they're doing this because they think that the student who wrote this paper actually has a lot of potential. And so they're grading that student's paper harshly in order to help them reach it. So let's say our student gets their paper back and notices that it's full of red ink marks and corrections from the teacher. How might that student interpret this? And how might that influence their self-image? First, they might observe that the teacher criticized them harshly on this paper. Second, they think that the teacher probably did so because they see the student as not being very intelligent. And then finally, our student comes to the conclusion that, based on this, they're probably not very good at literary analysis. So here the student is acting on an incorrect perception of what they think the teacher believes. And because our attitudes can often influence our behaviors, this might result in the student putting less effort into the class instead of more effort like the teacher originally wanted. But this doesn't have to be the end of our story, because it can also be influenced by future interactions. So let's say that the student talks to the teacher after class about why they graded so harshly. At that point, the teacher might explain that they think that the student is on the right track, but that they need to put in a little bit more effort. And so because of this additional interaction, the student was able to revise his or her incorrect perceptions, and this could lead the student to developing a different self-perspective.
So now moving on from that, we're going to get through some of the key theories in the world of identity. So first is identity theory from Stryker in the 60s. So obviously that was a decent amount of time ago, but eons ago when we think about actual identity as a field of study, right? Identity was not something people were really paying a lot of attention to in the 60s and 70s. It's much more of a modern thing, and really, the last 10 years, it's really, really blown up and gotten a lot more common and a lot more misunderstood too. So, keep the time period of these theories in mind as we move. But so Stryker talks about social behavior in terms of the relationship between self and society. So again, it's that idea that there's an outside influence on how we become who we are. But this also plays up the idea that identity isn't a static thing, it isn't a simple thing, it's constantly changing, but it does have some sort of sense of foundation. There's some kind of piece underlying it all, something that will be consistent, and that's where we get that sense of order. So some of the concepts within this are identity salience and identity commitment. Salience is just the idea that that identity will stay the same across a lot of different contexts. So when we talk about different physical places or different temporal places, that identity is still going to be the same. So there's something really important to you within that. So I'd say for me, being from Baltimore is always a really important part of my identity. I've not lived in Baltimore for 20 years now, more 21 years, but it still really, really shaped me as a child. And so no matter where I've been living, when people ask where I'm from, I say Baltimore. Even if I haven't been to Baltimore for years, it still is a really, really foundational piece for me. So that's a really, really salient part of my identity. Something that's less salient maybe would be that I am a professor. At WVU on campus, super relevant. When I'm hanging out with my friends, sometimes I forget what I even do, right? Like it just doesn't end up being a really, really important piece of my self-concept. So it's less salient than my identity of being from Baltimore. Identity commitment is the degree to which your connection to others requires your role. So this, when we think about the different roles that you might have within the family structure, it's going to be relevant there. There's an element of it that's almost transactional. So you perform the role in the environment to be able to have the role. Then there's another piece that is more related to your attitudes or your behaviors, your feelings about something. That's the affective piece. So how much, if I'm the firstborn daughter in my family, how important is that to my identity? It's not actually very important to my identity at all. It doesn't feel relevant a lot of the time. So I'm not thinking about that. Like there's a lot of people who are firstborn daughters and have a lot of stress that comes out of that and having to take on almost like a second mothering role. I didn't have that in my environment. So I don't have that kind of emotional connection to that role. It's something that exists. I have a little brother. He's annoying like all little brothers are, right? But that's not actually, it hasn't shaped my identity. It doesn't feel like it's made me take on additional stressors or burdens or anything because of that. So it's effective in the emotional piece, but it's very low in the affective for me. Hopefully this is making sense. So then an evolution out of identity theory is social identity theory. And so this is something that we see a lot more day to day, especially in the environment you guys are all in now as students. This is a really big piece of that. I think something that as we go through it, you'll recognize it. So social identity is who we are based on the memberships that we have. So the group memberships that we have, what are the different organizations that we belong to. So like we're all part of WVU, right? That's one shared collective membership. But there's others that you can have, from sports teams, from sororities, from jobs that you have, from being a first generation student or being a student worker, all different sorts of things that kind of connect to that broader identity. And then of course there's all the social connections that you'd have outside. So there are some assumptions with social identity theory. First is that people want to have a positive social identity. So you don't go into a situation wanting to not be liked or not be included in that group. I wouldn't try to rush with a sorority if I hated sororities and wanted to let everybody know how much better I thought I was than them because I think there's something wrong with Greek life, right? So you don't go into that environment trying to be, a pariah. You come into it wanting to be accepted, wanting to be part of that group. And then positive social identity is built on comparison. So in-group and out-group, we all know in-group and out-group, right? How well do you fit into an environment or a situation or a group of people? And so the theory says that if we come into a situation and we find ourselves in the out-group, we will immediately try to change that. So we won't stay in a context where we're part of the out-group. We'll find another group where we can be the in-group, or we'll work to change the group to switch out from out to in. Right? So negative or out-group identity is never acceptable. And so there's 3 stages through social identity theory. First is categorization, second is identification, and third is comparison. And so this is supposedly what we do when we come into an environment. So we come into a room, we categorize everything there, then we start to identify, okay, what are these different groups, what are these different categories that we've created, and then we start to make the comparisons between ourselves and those other categories. So take a minute and look over this cartoon here. So when we see this, they look very similar, right? Both sides of the water, slightly different architectural styles, but really it's just the colors, purple or gold. But we see how they're seeing each other. So, from a complete outsider's perspective, it looks quite similar. But when you're in here, one of these sides is the in-group and one of these sides is the out-group, based on where you're standing. So this is essentially what we're seeing when people come into social situations. There's always that kind of sense of belonging or superiority that we kind of teach ourselves to have about a context. So first, when we're coming through here, the categorization is based on external or internal criteria. And so these could be criteria that a person creates for themselves, or they could be criteria that exist as kind of the norm. So trying to fit into that normative structure. And then people will identify with a group. And so in the identification, what you start to do is share sympathies, right? So you develop similar emotional expectations or demands. You share feelings with the other people in the group, right? So if somebody's upset, you're going to have that collective feeling of we're all upset about this issue. You'll change your behavior sometimes to fit into that group a little bit better. So the identifying is almost taking on the roles, the concepts, any kind of identifying structures with that group. So you try to blend into it as much as you can. And then the comparison, at this point, can be comparison from you as now part of that in-group to the other groups around you. So in that comparison, you're trying to identify the ways where your group is superior to the others. So identifying that, perceived hierarchy or created hierarchy and building your esteem based on your membership in this specific group. And so this also leads to a maximization of the similarities within groups and then differences between groups. Right? It's easier to feel like we are better if other groups are different. If all the groups are the same, it's going to be hard to kind of build in that sense of we're better than you, right? Everybody actually is the same. And in that cartoon, even if really the only difference is the flags, it's going to be hard to really create some kind of foundation that says, okay, actually on this side of the water, we are superior to those on that side of the water. So you're really looking for the differences, and so those end up getting played up a little bit more than they would otherwise. And so within all of this, through that whole process of categorizing and becoming part of the group, we have this emotion of uncertainty. And so uncertainty reduction theory says that we constantly want to reduce uncertainty. It basically says that humans are never happy with uncertainty. We don't want there to be an unknown. And so if you want to get deeper into this, there are definite differences, east-west, right? So we think about theories like this, most of them have been created in a very Western-centric kind of environment. So they're going off of more of like a European model of social interaction. So there could be other contexts where actually uncertainty isn't seen as such a scary thing or something to be negated or done away with. So keep that in mind again as we go. Contextual pieces are really key. But so with uncertainty, we theoretically have 3 stages: entry, personal, and exit. So in the entry is when you're first getting into something, first starting to see what are the norms in that environment. Personal is when you're starting to try to get to know the people in the environment better, getting to know their attitudes, their beliefs, paying attention to their actions. What are the things that make this group exist? How does it exist? Why does it exist? And then the exit stage is where you either decide, okay, I know enough about this group and I want to be part of this, so I'm reducing my uncertainty by becoming part of it and learning more and more about it as I go, or I know a little bit about this group and I don't like it, so I want to leave, and so you remove yourself from the environment. So now you still might not know everything about that group, but you don't care anymore because you're no longer a part of it, you're no longer connected to it. So you're reducing the uncertainty by just leaving the situation. And so uncertainty basically says through all of this that we reduce it by learning, by getting new knowledge. And so we have 2 different types of uncertainty. We have cognitive, which is about what's happening inside, so the thinking processes, the attitudes that are kept in our head, right? Why do we think the way that we think about certain things? Or how are we interpreting different actions? And so that connects to the next piece, which is behavioral uncertainty. And so this is where we're paying attention to the doing. Why is this group doing that? Why is that person doing that? Do I have to do that as well? Right? So we have internal and external, essentially. So looking at the beliefs or attitudes versus the actions. So I have a couple examples here. If we were in a real live class, I would have given the examples and had you guys select which type of uncertainty they were, but I'm giving it all away here. But so just read through it, take a kind of minute, see if you can understand here. So in the situation, a friend was supposed to call you, but they didn't. So first question, to what degree do you feel you know what thoughts were going through your friend's mind and not calling? This is cognitive, right? You're thinking about what they were thinking. Then the next question, how can you predict what your friend will do next? This is behavior. It's all about their action or their inaction, right? So hopefully you can see the difference between these 2 types of uncertainty. Again, cognitive and behavioral uncertainty, really key terms. They're going to shape a lot. I'm sure when you get to the point of analyzing the media you select for your project, you're going to be thinking about a lot of cognitive and behavioral aspects in that, and uncertainty often drives us. So there could definitely be relevant things to come out of that, ways that you can apply this to your work. So like I said, there's a lot in this week, but hopefully you've gotten the key concepts in the mind map, the concept map assignment for this week. I did give you some of the keywords to take away from this. So I tried to give you a little bit of a hint about what's more or less important to pay attention to, but I would really strongly recommend going back through, maybe pausing on some of the slides just to pull all those notes out. These are really the foundation for the rest of the class, and so you need to have these theories in for everything else that comes to really make sense. So hopefully this was useful. Any questions or concerns, as usual, please let me know.